Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar topic on 7 pivots for the COVID age board. Basically talking about how the pandemic has changed and refocused board efforts. Kind of a fun topic to talk about with different trending that's happening, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of these trends with you today. And hopefully you can find ways to apply some of these changes or focus on these changes within your boardroom or for discussion areas for those that are aspiring board directors. All right, so I'm your host and speaker today, Mark Pfister. I'm a governance and strategy expert, a non-executive director and chief board consultant. I've worked with hundreds of public, private, and nonprofit boards with focus in strategy, governance, and technology cybersecurity. I've earned the nickname over the years of the board architect. I kind of like it. It's due to my work in defining the structural components of effective boards. And also I published a book on this particular topic called Across the Board, the Modern Architecture Behind an Effective Board of Directors. This book has made the rounds. It touched a nerve, I believe, globally with boards that were either struggling with ongoing problems and realizing through my writings that much of this is correlated back to the base foundational structure, or what I like to call the architecture of the board. So if you haven't read it, feel free to do so. All right, so purpose of today's webinar, to share knowledge and trending on the changes and pivots of global boards as a direct result of the pandemic. You'll see some aspects of the boards that I work with globally that I've infused into this particular discussion today. And the trending is pretty similar by different regions, and we'll talk about that. If you have questions, please put your questions in the Q&A section. I'll answer all questions at the close of the presentation. In some of my webinars, there's a significant number of questions, so if I can't get to those in our allocated time today, I will just follow up with emails afterwards on those particular questions. The materials, this question always comes up. The answer is yes, the entire webinar is being recorded. You'll receive a link in a day or two with the link to the video. And I also include the actual presentation file because there's actually links in there if you want to drill down on additional topics. Those links will work once you receive that particular presentation, this particular presentation file. And I mentioned about the additional topic references. So, all right, let's get started. For our goals today, learn the considerations and understand the reasons for these changes and pivots as they relate to the pandemic and as they relate internal to the boardroom. And think about how these changes and pivots can increase your board's effectiveness. So you may recognize some of these things happening within the boardrooms that you serve or the boards that you serve today. And there may be things that haven't come up or shown their face or been as prevalent as other boards have seen. So it's good to be on the lookout for these particular areas. So we'll touch on those topics. All right, so here's our path for today and what to really walk away with from today's discussion. I want to first talk about these immense challenges for boards, many of which were brought out by COVID and the pandemic. Talk about how this is not just strategic support and governance from the board anymore. There's some interesting trending that we're seeing in this area. Time allocation is another area that the pandemic has truly put a light on as it relates to boardrooms. We'll talk about some of what I'm calling this new age of transparency and why this came about and how it came about due to the pandemic. Risk and scenario planning, one of my favorite topics to talk about. Unfortunately, it's one of the least focused on areas in the boardroom. We'll touch on some of those things, both as it relates to boards that were exposed when the pandemic hit and what they're doing today to overcome that and really infuse this risk and scenario planning into their operations, the board operations. Forced digital transformation, this should not be a surprise to anybody on this particular discussion today. Political conversations, you probably realize already where I'm going with that, highly charged, lots going on in that realm, and that has permeated into the boardroom as well. We'll talk about where that should go back to for organizations and boards to get the best value from political conversations. And then we'll talk a little bit about how the pandemic accelerated the boards that were possibly a little bit behind in how they were collaborating. So we'll talk about the board portal aspect and other collaboration tools that are being used within those portals right now to effectively and efficiently collaborate. So that's our path for today, and you'll see this as we go through our discussion. All right, so let's start off with this intro of these immense challenges for boards and within boardrooms. So obviously boards of directors have not been immune to the pandemic's effects, experiencing additional risk components spread across entire corporate landscapes. And this really has become a major topic of discussion as it relates to governance. We're not through that yet. You would think that this was maybe front loaded with the pandemic when it hit. But even now, a significant number of months into this pandemic and hopefully coming out the other end, there are still some major aspects of these effects that many boards are still dealing with. So these number of challenges are many, and there's many knock-on effects, and these boards are working through these areas today. And I can give you some examples through today's discussion on how these boards have really gone through a cycle of highly reactive, and then hopefully moving more into the more proactive realm with certain trends that are emerging from this today. All right. So what are some of these challenges before we talk about the specific areas or the pivots? So the sheer size and number of these challenges, as I mentioned, are immense, and it's had unintended knock-on effects for many boards and organizations. So today we're still dealing with organizations making the decisions on vaccination mandates and what they should do in those areas. There's political alignments and the fallout from that, activists, as well as public perception as it relates back to pandemic-related items, remote workforce and remote boards. Many boards were not actually prepared to work fully remote. They were very much reliant on the face-to-face board meetings on a quarterly basis. So we'll talk a little bit about that as it relates to the collaboration. ESG should not be a surprise. Environmental, social governance areas, definitely top of discussion today in most boardrooms. Diversity and inclusion, or DEI, is also very, very prevalent, as you likely know, in boardrooms. Supply chain shortages, we could say this either is or is not a direct, or it does or does not have a direct relationship back to the pandemic, but there are likely many ties to this, and boards are dealing with this today along with their organizations. And we'll also point out this inflation aspect that we're seeing, not just in the US, but across many regions globally, that is playing another, or putting another challenge into these boards' areas of decisioning and focus. And there's many more we could touch on, but I just want to show there's so many different overlapping and standalone, as well as standalone issues that boards are dealing with today. And many boards and individual directors, we could even correlate this back to individual committees of boards, are truly becoming overloaded. And saying that in the pandemic they were overloaded, fine, but those directors, boards, and committees continue to be overloaded today with all the things that have been added onto their plates and their monitoring and their governance points, not to mention the input that's expected from a strategic standpoint. So all of this is kind of playing into what's called this cognitive load theory. And this is something I spent some time researching some time ago. And I wanted to understand how the human mind works through problems or challenges. And this can be viewed either at an individual level or at a group level. And I'm going to correlate this back to the board when I talk about the group level. So channel one of this cognitive load theory says that when confronted with a known challenge, especially in an area where there's deep expertise, the long-term memory kicks in, or that's the area that's tapped into, which helps to complete the task without much stress or strain. You know the problem, you've solved it before, you're relying on your expertise and experience on this in the long-term memory to solve that problem. That's known as channel one. Channel two is the more challenging area, and that's when you're confronted, or a board is confronted, or a group is confronted with an unknown or unfamiliar challenge. This forces all of us individually and as a group to leverage our working memory. And working memory is proven to be very limited in its capacity and duration for holding information. And this is one of the main reasons that we're seeing a lot of these challenges when many new and multiple challenges are experienced. Many groups, especially boards, struggle with this. It's less familiar. They're relying on their working memory to solve this. And it's in some cases making the solution more difficult for these groups. So know that there is a science in the background of all of this loading that's happening with either groups or boards, or any level of an organization. And it all relates back to this cognitive load theory. This can put a lot of strain and stress on an organization and the board when there are many aspects that require the working memory to be tapped into for multiple simultaneous issues that are happening and need to be solved. So whether or not we've truly been collectively overloaded or not, depending on the board you're serving or your particular role, there are some very obvious pivots we're seeing in the boardroom. And I want to correlate these back to 7 specific refocus areas, or I should say maybe additional focus areas in the boardroom. Now, all of this is relating back to an article I wrote almost exactly a year ago. It was November 19th of 2020. Same title as this particular webinar, 7 Pivots for the COVID Age Board. And again, at that point in time, many of these trends were emerging. So they were in some of the earlier stages. Now we're seeing that these trends have matured a little bit in terms of them being recognized, and I'll say some boards have actually honed some of the skill sets around these areas and likely moved this more into their long-term memory rather than their working memory that we just talked about a moment ago. So the hope is that the stresses and strains on many boardrooms that are pandemic related are starting to relieve based on these trends being a little further along in their evolution. So let's first talk about what I'm calling not just strategic support and governance anymore. And this is one of the first pivots that we saw very early. So the pandemic forced what would normally be multiple lesser, what I like to call days of reckoning, essentially into one colossal event. So you can think about this even in your personal life. You may have all these small things that are out there, and then all of a sudden they're all needed at the same time. It can be overwhelming, even though individually there may be potentially most of them are smaller events or smaller focus areas. This has caused what I like to call also governance simultaneity. And this has to do with the increased and complicated interrelationship of required decision-making in times of crisis. And many times this happens, as I'm mentioning, within a highly restricted time period. So keep in mind that governance simultaneity is, I believe, a challenge for many boards, especially when there's a major crisis, whether it's on a global scale or a more micro scale for their organization or their industry for that matter, that this can be, again, something that becomes very overwhelming. And that overwhelming aspect of all of these simultaneous things happening at once, it obviously adds this emotional stress and distress on those that are leading the organization and anybody that's an employee in the organization. So what's interesting in this trending is that boards were all of a sudden thrust into this realm of becoming essentially an additional emotional support arm for their CEOs and potentially other C-level executives within the organization. And I'll add to that that many board directors became emotional support arms for other board directors, right? Because of this loading and this governance simultaneity. All of this happening at once really threw some boards for a loop due to the fact that they just weren't prepared, nor did they know how to give the proper emotional support to those that truly needed it. And the stress level of CEOs, there's studies that's been done on this since the start of the pandemic. Stress level on CEOs reached an extremely high level, especially in the early months of the pandemic, based on this governance simultaneity that I'm discussing right now. So again, while the board was dealing with its own emotional distress, many boards were forced into the realm of acting as this emotional support arm. Many of them were not prepared to do this, either dealing with their own emotional support areas or those within the boardroom. But I can tell you that the CEOs that experience this emotional support arm or just direct support through the board, they created extremely strong bonds in their organization between the board and the CEO, based on this area of support that went above and beyond just the technical components that a board would normally support in relation to their CEO. So saying all of this, we look at boards that had and have high emotional intelligence and mindfulness intelligence. These boards fared much better during these times of the pandemic and were truly able to support and provide this well-rounded support for their board members, their fellow board members, as well as the C-level and especially for their CEOs. This was very obvious for someone such as me in the board consulting realm in seeing this and how these groups came together, and they were ready to do that, so regardless of what crises they were dealing with, versus the boards that were really keeping the CEO at almost an arm's length and maybe not creating that type of relationship that had the trust and the respect that was needed. All of this relates back to that emotional and intelligence and mindfulness intelligence that boards should really be focusing on, and choosing CEOs that have deep EQ and MQ as well. All right. Another pivot number 2. Time allocation. So we've likely all heard of the required time or the accepted amount of time as it relates to a board director's commitments for each one of the boards they serve on. But crises have this uncanny way of requiring more time from board directors, right? Shouldn't be a surprise. So throughout this COVID-19 pandemic, especially in the early months of this, we saw an incredible spike and a sharp increase in the amount of time required by directors to not only work through the mitigation of risks, but also through the strategic and governance involvement that was needed from these boards. So we're starting to see this settle back a little bit, back to the normal numbers that you're seeing here. But again, it was extremely obvious for boards that had directors that were overboarded, meaning serving on too many boards at one time, and then not able to prioritize or even have the available time to properly service the boards that they were serving on. All right, so many boards saw a 2 to 3 times increase in time commitment during COVID. As I mentioned, and again, for obvious reasons. Now, this again has been complicated by the overboarding aspect and too many competing critical priorities. Let me dig into that one for a moment. So the number of organizations that used to allow their CEO, as an example, to sit on outside boards, that number has drastically decreased in the last decade. And for many reasons, which the pandemic brought out, which is when you go through these types of crises, where is that CEO, as an example, where is their time being focused? Is it 100% or 110% dedicated to the organization that they're leading as CEO? Or are they carving out portions of that time dedication for other boards, maybe even more than one that they serve on? Well, many boards are not putting up with that anymore, and they're actually either limiting the number of boards their CEO can serve on, or actually stating that they don't want that CEO to serve on any other boards, and they have the right to do that through their agreements. So the big question is could this have, all of these topics that I'm mentioning, could this have measurable long-term effects for future board yearly time expectations? I believe the answer is yes. I don't know where that number is going to settle out. And it's likely going to be settled into specific committees of a board, such as an audit committee. A risk committee is another prime example of a group or a committee that's going to really have, I believe, an ongoing increase in time commitment for their organizations. So again, we'll see where this settles out, but even the compensation discussions and the trending we're seeing right now are likely going to follow this scale in the upward direction. As the time increases likely stick, we're likely going to see increases in compensation that directly correlate to that curve as well. Okay, pivot number 3, this new age of transparency. So this was, of course, an increasing demand of both shareholders and stakeholders in an effort to gain an understanding of how and if the organization was previously prepared to weather the effects of a major risk such as a pandemic. Now, we could not have obviously predicted the pandemic when it happened, but the requests of shareholders and stakeholders were quite quick and quite direct, asking what these organizations were doing immediately and where they planned on going. Right? Seems like pretty obvious questions to ask that a board and an organization should be able to answer without any hesitation. But we did see hesitation. We saw actually major delays in the disclosure from organizations of what they were doing and where they were focusing their efforts. I joke a little bit to say that some boards have this history of glossophobia, or the fear of public speaking. That truly came out during the early stages of the pandemic. And for those that did not have this narrative created, or a proper narrative created that was based on factual instances, in a moment we're going to talk about scenario planning and risk mitigation areas as an example. Those that did not embrace those types of focus areas for their boards and their organizations, and the transparency around that, truly struggled with what their public-facing narrative was, and it really hurt these organizations, both internally and externally. So we saw a lot of this go on, again, definitely in the early stage of the pandemic, and I still think some organizations are actually quite light in their communication on what they accomplished during this time frame and where they're going next, and what they've learned from this particular hurdle that they've been working through for almost 2 years now. So these questions that relate to transparency, they're not easy or simple questions for boards to answer, even though they should have been. So referenceable risk mitigation plans I mentioned a moment ago. Supply chain, right? That should be top of mind for many folks, especially as we go into the holiday season on a personal level, and for many businesses at a professional level or corporate level are struggling right now to get some of the simple parts or services they need based on these supply chain holdups. So supply chain critical path and alternates should have been an area that many boards and organizations were focused on. What and when to communicate, both internally to employees and externally to shareholders and stakeholders. And then this thought process that every board and organization should be thinking of today, and whether you view it as a shift or a balance, depends on you what word you want to choose from this for this. I've specifically stated here, shift from shareholder primacy to multi-stakeholder focus. And this was another thing that was missed by many boards in how they communicated or guided their CEO to communicate in an effort to ensure employee and customer safety and well-being. This was a big miss for many organizations, and you can directly trace this back to the board just not being prepared through any type of scenario planning or anything related to that risk area of what are they communicating in something that drove, for many of these organizations, their entire workforce remote. These are big issues to deal with, but if you take them in piecemeal and they're talked about and understood, it doesn't matter what the event is that causes these things to happen or how many to happen. It's just that they're focused on individually, and then you can pull those together on an as needed basis depending on what that risk is being experienced. So this path to controlling a purposeful narrative again was much bumpier for those organizations that were previously embracing than those that were previously embracing transparency. So in other words, with this, the boards that and organizations that were already communicating and directing and guiding their CEO and organization to communicate important points of not just the bottom line and the profitability of these organizations, but also other components inclusive of ESG components, they were much more ready and available for that matter for the communication that mattered very much so to those that were looking in from the outside, especially during the pandemic phase. Favorite cartoon of mine right now that you see here, let's never forget that the public's desire for transparency has to be balanced by our need for concealment. This may not have been such a joke some years ago, but today this is obviously not acceptable as it relates to boardroom operations and what the board is there to do. But we did see some of this, the bad aspect or the funny aspect of this with the board's preparedness to guide the communication throughout the pandemic areas. Don't be one of those directors and don't be one of those boards is really the summary of this. All right, that brings us into the risk and scenario planning as it relates to pivot number 4 on our list for today. A high percentage of boards still to this day spend little or no time on scenario planning as a proactive way to mitigate risk. Huge mistake. So those boards with robust risk and scenario planning activities actually fared much better during this particular pandemic. They were ready for this. They did not predict the pandemic, but many of the major risks to their organizations were identified. And then, of course, they came to be during the pandemic. So the boards that were actually proactively working through responses and looking at how to minimize the impact, they were able to pull from their tool belts and from their inventory of knowledge and preparedness to actually be ready for these core components that were needed to be addressed on a moment's notice to protect these companies, even at the early stages of the pandemic. What we're seeing today is that there's more discussion in the boardroom around bringing in this approach of scenario planning as it relates to risk. I would tell you on my experiences, it's still nowhere near where it needs to be effective if indeed something of the scale of a pandemic like COVID-19 hits again. I just don't think they're prepared for that. Many boards will actually put the scenario planning as the last item on their agenda, and it's kind of, if there's time, we'll focus on this. Well, I think this really needs to move to the earlier stage of the agenda and even have a home either through a risk committee or some other relevant committee on the board that has a home and ownership of this and drives us through the board, which then again trickles down throughout the organization. So Let me touch quickly on this forced digital transformation. For many on today's webinar, this should not be a surprise to you as well to see this digital transformation come up. This in the past for many boards, even if they were considered to be pet projects of the board or direct governance oversight by a board, these were usually put off to the and not addressed to the level they needed to be, especially to handle something of the magnitude of this particular pandemic. So pre-COVID, digital transformation was commonly a topic that was extremely important to boards, but really not viewed as urgent. The organization was still operating, the profitability may have still been there, but for many organizations, this pandemic changed this belief system or this understanding overnight, and it layered in to this recovery aspect, another extremely challenging and costly project or focus area alongside countless other immediate focus areas. It just became overwhelming. So the organizations that pushed off their digital transformation, they were forced to do this at the same time that all of these other focus areas were needing attention. And for many, it not only rendered a large number of organizations less than optimal, some of them were actually unable to support a remote workforce. So maybe some of those on today's webinar experienced this, where they went not only a few days, but possibly a few weeks where they did not have the ability to work remotely for the organizations that they were employed by. This is truly a miss by the board and a miss by the organization, especially as it relates back to the risk area and the risk mitigation areas of an organization. So this forced digital transformation really became a topic of boardrooms very quickly. And these implementation windows that are required to put together a robust strategy, and then of course the rollout for these particular digital transformations, a lot of this did not go well. It was another major source of misused funds and budgets for organizations, but really put this particularly on their radars moving forward. By the way, one of the trends we're seeing right now as it relates to digital transformation is the drive and the search, excuse me, for board directors that have deep digital transformation background, especially as it relates to the correlation to technology or cybersecurity committees within boards. So know that if you have a digital transformation background or experience in that space, that can truly be something to leverage as it relates to the ability to not only get board interviews, but also land those board seats. So another funny cartoon here: who led the digital transformation initiative in your organization, CEO or CIO? And this other gentleman answers back, no, COVID-19. We likely laugh at that, but that's truly what was driving the digital transformation, or at least became the impetus to start these programs or continue them and speed them up to support their remote workforce and their clients for that matter. All right, political conversations. This is an interesting one to talk about. We're in very strange times right now, I'll say, where it's very hard to even talk about politics. It used to be you could talk about this and people would listen and you give your point of view, someone else would give their point of view, even from totally different aspects and belief systems. But you walked away, you were friends, right? You took that input, you may have even fed it into some of your thought process on what was correct and what was incorrect, or maybe there is no correct or incorrect, right? So these political conversations have moved, unfortunately, more into affiliated party conversations in the boardroom when they were rightfully in the past associated with policy debates. So the easiest way to think about this is that what discussion in the boardroom as it relates to politics has the best effect on the organization, or the most relevant effect on the organization. And it's very easy to see that that's based on policy debates or policy discussions in the boardroom. What is legislation that's being worked on that could become law, or when does that become law? How does that affect our business? Does it affect our strategy? Is there additional regulation? Do we change the makeup of our board? All these types of things are the debates that used to happen, or the discussions of policy. And we've moved into this realm now where, yes, there's probably still a good amount of policy debates, but some of these discussions have moved into these affiliated party conversations. And that's when I personally believe that these organizations, inclusive and starting with their board, they're truly off track when it goes down that path. I'm personally not a big fan of corporations, or even boards for that matter, making political statements. I think that it's a no-win scenario for many of these organizations because, in the environment, if we use the US as an example, 50% of any population, if you go down the political route, is either going to be happy, or the other 50% is going to be unhappy. It's almost a no-win situation. And most boards today are agreeing that they want to stay out of the politics realm, both outside of the boardroom, as well as internal to the boardroom, move these affiliated party conversations more into the policy debate area, or back into the policy debate area. Be a smart move for these organizations to do, again, because it's what truly benefits these organizations are the policy debates. All right, we talked about some of these areas here, but just to continue a little bit further on these political conversation areas, remember too that when we talk about diversity, truly diverse boards also contain a mix of political beliefs, right? Some of the most worrisome boards that I've consulted to in the past are all made up of the same political beliefs, or affiliated with the same political party. And when we talk about diversity, that is a portion of diversity that also needs to be considered for a truly effective and efficient board. And looking at things from multiple different angles. And when the board has that emotional intelligence and that mindfulness intelligence to be able to do that, not only have those members, mixed members on the board of political backgrounds and beliefs, but also leverage those, and they're able to talk about those in a productive way, it really is a differentiator for these organizations. So again, just in closing on this particular political conversations topic, we could probably speak hours about this, but the organization is relying on the board's guidance regarding policy topics, not political affiliations, and be that director that guides these conversations back to the proper area of the policy discussions. Don't be scared to do that. It really has a huge benefit to the organization by being the person that can help to bring that back on track. All right, the ease and effectiveness of and the collaboration components. So this is another area as it relates to the pivots in the boardroom. This is pivot number 7. This ease and effectiveness of communication has always been the hallmark of great boards. It's one of the first things I look for in the boards that I'm either assisting or consulting with, or helping to rebuild, or doing assessments with. I look for what is the level of communication, not just on a one-on-one basis, but offline or remote. How are they communicating? So the COVID-19 pandemic, unsurprisingly, has greatly heightened the need for proper board communication, and in most cases, the functionality for an entirely remote environment. Many of the boards I work with are still operating in a remote environment. They still have not met in person since the start of the pandemic. We'll start to see that come back. I've already seen in multiple cases that the in-person meetings are starting to show up on the calendars again for 2022. And that will likely continue. But know that one of the best things that has come out of this pandemic, I guess if you could say there was something good that came out of the pandemic that was related to boards, is that it pushed many boards to look at how they're communicating, how they're making decisions, how they're voting, how they're sharing information, how they can still be collaborative even if they're not in person. And even for the times when boards were meeting in person for their 4 to 6 rough board meetings a year, they've become more effective now with the implementation of these board portals for the time that sits between those formal in-person board meetings. So this pandemic has actually ushered in the age of this board digitization on a very large scale. And I think it's already become the norm and not simply a nice to have for these organizations. If I give one other bit of information on this, when the pandemic first hit, the number of boards that were rendered almost useless, like I can honestly use that terminology, when they weren't able to meet in person because they were not using communication tools or board portals for that matter, the number of boards that were just ineffective was extremely high. And that went on for months. So think about the fact that these these transformation projects were happening, the stress of getting potentially a full remote workforce up and running. And then all of a sudden the board's coming to the table saying, hey, listen, I need help from the technology group to roll out this board portal at the same time. It almost seems laughable because all of that could have been done in advance and should have been done in advance to have these communication tools available to the board. So thinking about this also as it relates to collaboration and board portals, properly evaluating the correct board portal software and service for your organization. It's important. There's right-sizing components to this. There's adoption components to this to think about. And overall, you really want to look at this holistically and think about the information sharing components, the ease of communication, the board book and the meeting agendas that are created. Can you do that more automated or have that in one central location? The sharing and accessing of documents, calendar sharing and scheduling. I can tell you that whether it's a board member doing this or it is someone in the organization that's helping with the scheduling of board directors, as the board sizes increase, which is a trend right now as well, as those sizes of those boards increase, the challenge of scheduling for board meetings or even committee meetings has grown, and we're going to continue to see that to grow as I believe the board sizes are going to increase in the upcoming years. So something such as a board portal can help out with that as well and automate those processes. Goes without saying, board committee collaboration. And there's some interesting developments as it relates to either AI integration in some of this board portal software, evaluations and those things of the board. But this talk to text, some boards love this, some boards hate it. Some boards don't want every word they say actually dictated and put into a document. Whereas others say, listen, this is the best way to keep our minutes to our board meetings, and you know, we have nothing to hide and we want to do this. So just know there's different ways to leverage the board portal above and beyond this information sharing and the ease of communication. And we're going to see more of these developments as it relates to efficiency and effectiveness that can be done through these board portals in, I think, the near future. So these portals in many cases are modularized. They have add-ons. They're a great way to get early adoption on certain modules and then expand on that for the board to master the functionality of each one of those modules as they get to use the board portal more often. Give a couple of examples here. I've actually worked with all of these particular board portals, different varying levels of where I think they're a best fit for different organizations or different entity types, public, private, nonprofit. One of them here, as you see, is actually designed specifically for nonprofit organizations, but there are ways to do studies. I've personally been involved in leading the evaluation programs and projects for organizations and boards to decide which one is the best fit for them. Lots of work in that, but quite fun to see all the functionality and what these particular softwares are capable of doing today. It's really a big difference from even 5 years ago. And bringing some of the automation into the boardroom, which is nice to see. Okay. All right, so just as one of the closing comments here before we move to some of the questions, know that as a board director or even an aspiring board director, I asked the question, have you quickly adapted to the new normal of these 7 areas and possibly many more that we're going to see evolve in the upcoming months and years? Question yourself, have you adapted to this new normal? Are these things that are happening in the boardroom currently or in the boards you serve? Are these topics of discussion there? What have you learned from the challenges and the struggles of the pandemic? And are these long lasting? Are they going to be there? Are they going to evolve into something even better in the future once they have the adoption? So important questions to ask yourself as a director. And I definitely propose that you also add this question to the overall board. Ask them, have they adapted to this new normal in this post-COVID realm of the expectations of boards? Just quickly before we get to some of the questions, know that there's a program that touches on many of the topics we're talking about today. Some of you I see on today's, attending today's webinar have actually gone through this program. They're attending today to get their CPE credits for their ongoing certification. And for those that are not familiar with this program and certification and education, I welcome you to visit the website to see a little more about this. I believe it's the most robust program on the market right now that covers not just the modern board operations, but also how to package yourself correctly for consideration to truly land those coveted and compensated board seats. Let me move to some of the questions right now. I see we have a few here. Hi, Mark. Thanks for this webinar. In one area of risk scenario planning, what have been the most helpful outputs you've seen of tabletop exercises? I should have used that term. This is from Scott. I should have used that term tabletop exercises as well to describe these particular focus areas, preparing for possible cyber penetration. So great question. The cyber question always comes up when I talk about this topic. So I'm very appreciative you're asking that as well, Scott. I would tell you there's different levels on this. So when I'm specifically referencing at the board level, the scenario planning or the tabletop exercises, I like to think of this at the governance level of the cyber area. So I wouldn't necessarily say specifically the penetration area or say the pen testing area as it relates to cyber. I would look at this at a higher level for a board, and it's what I look for in boards to say, do they have not only someone who is able to speak at the technical level in the boardroom, but also does a majority, if not all the board directors know what a framework or what model they're using so they can ask the right questions, even if they have no technology background or if they have no cyber background, can they still understand that there are frameworks that organizations adopt? A great one as a reference point is NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They have a whole cybersecurity framework. Many organizations start with that and then hone that and evolve that into something that's more so a fit directly for their organization. But that NIST framework for cybersecurity is a prime example of saying, listen, this board, we're going to align around this so we know that there's 5 or 6 different phases to look at in these particular aspects. And then let's pick one of these scenarios. Let's pick, Scott, as you mentioned here, there was a breach of our data. What happens next in this process? What are the communications that are going to go out? We already know that there's requirements in the US from the SEC for a 72-hour notification if there was a breach that affected data of an organization. So there's so many moving parts to this, but a board can be very honed and focused by understanding what their framework is, how that relates to the governance aspect from a reactive standpoint, and how it relates to the strategy standpoint from a proactive look ahead standpoint to say, are we ready for this? Those are the areas I look for in those tabletop exercises that maybe are a few steps or levels above the more tactical components that you'd see within the organization or within those areas that are actually providing that protection or the responses to those cyber breaches. I hope that's helpful, Scott. Another question, this is a comment. This comment says, many boards are still struggling with digital transformation. I agree with that. I see that personally. And I think that's going to go on for some time. You know, many of these digital transformation projects are not one and done. They're not 1 or 2 month projects. They're long-term projects. I've personally been involved with digital transformation projects for ratings companies, and those take years to get done. I just wish that they started them or became more entrenched in those projects earlier, so it wasn't something like a pandemic that actually brought out the worst part of this as it relates to the organization and the stress of the organization. So totally agree with your comment that many boards are still struggling with digital transformation. Another question here regarding director time allocation. Where do you believe this will settle? So we talked about that a little bit. As of right now, I think that base number for any board, I don't care if it's public, private, or nonprofit, I think that base number falls around 200 hours a year during normal operations. And then you're adding on top of that for the functionality of the other areas you're servicing. So if you are a member of a board or a board chair, you're going to tack on another 40 to 50 hours. If you're the chair of the board, you're going to tack on another 50 hours on top of that. There is a nice clean formula you can use for this, which is extremely accurate. It's both in the experience I have in working with boards. It's very clear that that's the average time that many boards are putting in, and even studies such as NACD has done shows that we're right around that mark also for someone who's on a board and serving on a committee. You're right around that 248 hours a year. But remember, these are during times of normal operations. So to answer the question, do we think this is going to settle? I do think it'll settle back down from where it's at. Some boards are still at that 2 to 3 times that number I'm mentioning right now. It's a significant amount of time for a board to be putting in. We're starting to see it come back down. I do think it's all going to settle out, as I mentioned a moment ago. I think it's going to settle out slightly higher than the numbers I'm mentioning. But that's been the trending to date anyway. We've seen the requirements of boards increasing in the last decade, and you can actually track and trend that additional time in terms of hours that board directors are putting in. So I do think it's going to settle, but I think we're going to see a small increase in that on a yearly basis, and a pretty steady increase in the upcoming years. Okay. Another question. The boards I have served on have never done scenario planning. Yeah. Too many items already on the agenda. How do you kick this off and get it started? So great question. I can tell you that a board has to first realize and be educated on the need for this and the value of doing this. And the correlation to make on this is the relationship to risk, and not just risk to the organization, but risk to individual board directors. Nothing scares a board director more than the possibility of them being named in a lawsuit or something that's related to them being in a case study in the future, and a case study not for the right reasons. So what I like to see are these scenario planning aspects related back directly in the home, or having a home within the risk committee, if there is a risk committee, and it being run through that area, truly making it part of the charter of the risk committee or the ownership of the risk areas, if there's no risk committee, of that particular board. And by doing that, it becomes sort of part of this known and repeatable process. Some boards I work with, I even recommend that they choose one specific risk scenario area or the scenario planning area for each one of their board meetings, and dedicate, even if it's only 30 minutes, let the topic come up, let the committees step away that have ownership of certain areas with what they would do in those scenarios, and then bring it back for a short discussion on it. Even those small touch points on what could consider to be major risk for an organization, just that discussion, the starting off of that discussion, can have major positive repercussions for these particular boards. And by infusing that process into the DNA of boards through their board meetings and the involvement of their committees, it starts to stick. And you'll see that if you try this, it actually becomes part of the DNA of these boards very quickly. But that initial hurdle is the hardest part. And I appreciate your question on this, Mike, that getting it kicked off, I would truly try to choose some of the biggest challenges facing the organization and the board at that moment, and use that as one of those scenario points to kick off that particular process. It's top of mind, it's fresh in people's thought processes. It likely has the fear of the board in them because they know it's a major risk. Use that as your kicking off point and your starting point. You'll probably get a lot more traction early on in the process. All right, another question here. Do a quick time check. All right, we're pretty good on time. Political conversations have become toxic in many boardrooms. I agree. Do you have any recommendations on how to solve this? Yeah, so we started to discuss this. I think this question may have come in before we got into some more detail on that political conversations as one of the pivot points. I would just say this: be the board member who drives the conversation back to policy. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Don't put yourself in the realm where it's about the politics as it relates to party or the individual decisions or individual outcomes. Look at the policies that actually affect the industry vertical, that affect your organization, and that affect you as a board, as part of the board. And you'd be surprised, just that slight change of the lens on politics in the boardroom, it can very easily bring us back to the proper discussions, as they should be, relating to the policy components and the effect of the organization. One of the pieces of advice I gave a board member some time ago that was having trouble separating those two aspects of the party versus policy, I said to them, put yourself in the shoes of a potential employee of your organization that came as an observer of the board. And you specifically invited them to watch anything related to the policy or political aspect. What types of things would you do with that particular employee in the room? And again, this is not knowing their political affiliation. This is not knowing anything about their belief system, other than hopefully they're aligned to your ethics and your values and your culture, right? But as it relates to the politics component of this, think about how you would present the areas that you're not only discussing as it relates to politics, again, the policy areas, but also what are you pulling out from those policies that have a direct effect on the employee that's sitting in the room at that time as you're as your potential observer. What are they going to care about as part of the outcome of the fact that you're talking about politics in the boardroom? And 100% of the time you'll see this, it will be based off of the policy aspects, not what happened in the news in the previous day or the previous month, or what some political leader is doing. Talk about the policy, the potential policy that's being discussed, the one that may be in the process of ratification, or possibly the one that has a specific date when it's going to become relevant. Those are the areas that have the best and the biggest benefit to not only the board and helps to build the camaraderie of the board, but also has the best benefit and outcome on a proactive side for the organization. I hope that helps a little bit. I know there's many pieces we could talk about as part of this political conversation. It just seems to be this flashpoint for most topics today, but we have to get the proper aspect of politics back in the boardroom. And again, I'll say it, you've heard me say it multiple times, it's the policy discussions that matter in the boardroom, not the political affiliations or the party affiliations. I would like to thank everybody for joining today, and always appreciate it for those that join, especially my regulars. So thank you very much. Enjoy your day. Bye now.